as Renee said, we're gonna get ourselves there. So today, speaking of which, we're going to spend most of our time, and I'm going to go quickly at the outset. We will send this deck out so everyone's got it. Really pleased to have Michael Scissions, one of our gurus and CEO at Careerlist, to moderate a conversation around remote work and really how to implement best practices. And he'll introduce both Bob and Barb, who are going to take us through how to do this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the breakaway outlook. I don't think this is going to be a surprise to anybody, but our outlook is, Q1, Q2 are going to be tough, continue to be tough. Unfortunately, I think most of the projections now is that we did not do the things that we needed to do over the holidays to get COVID under control. And as much as we were hoping, I think in our last conversation, to say that June would be the turning point, it really looks like September is going to be the turning point. Some quick data here again that I'll send out to you afterwards. This is recently from both Goldman Sachs and a number of the hospitals in the U.S. I think we're all familiar with this. In terms of some of the numbers that we didn't want to be starting the new year with, but we are. On a positive side, on the economic side, there's a lot of capacity in the economy. Continue to see, an environment of low interest rates, low inflation, and significant capacity is net positive for growth. And as we talked about in our last session, our portfolio performed exceptionally well in this environment last year, growing 100% year on year, which is fantastic. And I really do think, we're going to, even coming into the second half post-COVID, we're going to have a little bit of a roaring 20s experience, as we all kind of are excited about not having this overhang on us. And so it's going to be one hell of a party. Whether or not September or December, not sure, but excited about that's in front of us. And Adrian, do you want to add anything in terms of your outlook? Any different perspectives?
Thank you very much.
Not really a lot to add. I guess the biggest question everybody has right now is the whole vaccine situation. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of the vaccine. I think they're safe. I think the side effect profile is extremely low. There's always going to be anaphylactic reactions to every single vaccine out there, but the instance with the COVID vaccine doesn't seem to be any higher than any of the other vaccines out there. I'm actually getting my first shot next Tuesday, I think. Moderna, I think I'm getting. It's important, obviously, to keep wearing a mask after you've had the vaccine. Also, if you've been unfortunate enough to have had COVID, even in a mild form or even a more severe form, you still will qualify for the vaccine if you want it. So it's not a contraindication. You can still get COVID even though you've been vaccinated, but the research shows that the illness will most likely be extremely mild, if not completely asymptomatic. So that's go to a lot of feedback.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Bob. That might be you.
Is that me?
Not sure. No, we got. It was Lawrence. We're good.
Okay.
Sorry, played a little God mode there for a second.
So my plea to you is get out there and promote the vaccine if you can. If you have any objections to the vaccine, I'd be happy to sort of discuss those with you. But I think it's a good thing. It's a thing that everybody should do. And as soon as we get to 70 to 80% of the population immunized, we should be well on the way to the downward slope, so to speak. I don't really have a lot more to add. Everything is out there on the CDC website. You'll see a lot of information, good information there about the FAQs around the vaccine. Yeah, not much more to add, really.
All right. So given it's going to be both a challenging and a fun year, how the hell do we operate with great success? I'm really pleased to turn it over to Michael, Barb, and Bob to take us through some thoughts, and we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So Michael, over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. And really excited to have Bob here today, who is a senior lecturer over at MIT Sloan, and fellow at the Brookings Institute until 2010. He was chairman of MFS Investment Management and was previously president of Fidelity. You got lots of words in there, Bob. I'm trying to, that's some long ones. I'm trying to do my best here. He's got a new upcoming book that I'm going to let him speak with in more detail, and we'll get a little sneak peek of today. We also have Barb Bidan with us, who was most recently the SVP of Global Talent at Peloton, and she has worked across a number of HR organizations, including leading people at Envision, and has been a pioneer of a completely distributed business model. So we're going to get both Barb and Robert to share some of their wisdom with us today, and then we'll open up the floor to questions following, and work to have us concluded here for 4 o'clock. So Bob, I'll turn it over to you, and look forward to hearing some details about this upcoming book.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Glad to be with you and with Barb and with everybody here. So starting with this slide on today's agenda, we're going to focus on 2 different topics, a new framework for remote work, and then what the hybrid model for future work might look like. And in each case, I'm going to give a short presentation, and I mean short, 5-6 minutes. Then Barb's going to comment on how this looks from the point of view of not only Peloton, but the other companies she's worked with. And then we're going to have time for discussion. So each of these segments should take about 20 minutes, and hopefully it should be fun and informative. So let's go to the first slide, next slide, if we could. We want to get on to the next slide, slide 8. Great. So the main thesis of my new book called Remote Incorporated is that you shouldn't just take what you've been doing in the office and replicate it at home. You really need to take a totally different approach. And there are certain sort of principles involved here. One is that rather than thinking about a 9 to 6 day or a normal work day, you have to get off that whole idea and move to what are your results? What are the results that you're getting accomplished? So getting out of hours and moving to results. The second principle is that in order to do this, employees need to change their mindset. They need no longer to think of getting instructions from their boss. They need to think as if they are running their own business. And it's a small business, but they have control over it. And in order to do this, employees need to treat their boss as their client. So this is someone that they have to deliver for, but the client doesn't tell them exactly when to work or how to work. Next slide. So slide 9. So how do we operationalize this? And again, 3 simple points here is the manager of the team, because he or she knows the organization and its needs much better, sets the objectives for the team. But then the team negotiates with the manager as to what should be the success metrics. Success metrics are the deliverables with deadlines that take these general objectives and turn them into specific to-dos. And then once you have these success metrics with a time deadline, it's up to the team how and when they get the work done. So the idea is by establishing these success metrics, you've freed up the remote workers to have the flexibility on how they're going to get stuff done. Next slide. So what are the benefits of success metrics? I'm like president of the Success Metrics Club. Is first, it takes what are often general objectives, say like improve customer service, and it makes them concrete. It gives them metrics. It gives them time frames. It gives something that everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Second of all, because of success metrics, and we know what the outcomes are supposed to be, There's no reason for the boss to come by every other minute or every other hour and micromanage. This is a big problem in a lot of offices, and by having success metrics, you can avoid that problem in remote work. We don't want to see companies monitoring your screen time, your phone time, that's just a replication of micromanagement. And the third big benefit is that it promotes work-life balance for the employees, because it's up to them when and how they get the work done. So that means they can have flexible hours and they can be much more responsive to the needs of their family and at home. So let's go to Barb now.
Thanks, Bob. So I feel like a lot of what I'm about to share is going to sound a lot like I'm saying, be a good leader. And that's not untrue. If I were to start by leaving you with one key takeaway as far as practical considerations around remote work, it would be that in my experience, there seem to be lots of ways that our teams end up filling gaps that exist in poor leadership practices within our teams. And so while many think that or expect that remote work might expose employees who aren't putting in a full day's work, my experience is actually that there's no faster way to expose the gaps in leadership skill set among your leaders than to move to a remote working environment. So a lot of this stuff is going to sound like tuning up your leadership practices. First, tighten goal setting practices. Seems obvious, but what this means is that if you don't have time-bound goals for the company and maybe some level of connectedness to functional goals and individual goals, you need to do that. I think a lot of folks will raise their hand and say, oh, we absolutely do that. I would encourage a gut check on that and a way to test where you actually are today by choosing a few team members at random and asking them at the individual level what their goals are that they're working on within the current time period, whether that's weekly for you, whether that's within a sprint if you're a software engineering team, monthly, quarterly, whatever the case. But if they can't tell you clearly what their goals are without going and looking it up and referencing some secondary document, my question would be whether they really have good clarity on where their work should be invested over time. So some upfront goal setting practices are pretty critical. As Bob already shared, I've got let go of micromanaging people, and I like to challenge leaders on this as well. I think there are obvious micromanaging behaviors that we can catch ourselves on, but there are some that are not so obvious too. So I would encourage leaders to think about this and spend more time being self-critical around this than you might think you need to be. What are the micromanaging behaviors that you rely on, whether that's managing by walking around, whether that's the really frequent check-ins and those sorts of things, being able to understand where those behaviors are within you and within your own team, and looking to get rid of those to the best of your ability if you don't really need them, or replace them with something more appropriate and aligned towards objective-based management. Review critical metrics real time, anytime. I think virtual has shone a light on the need for real time data. So we're seeing a lot of companies implement different tools for dashboards that are just a lot more real time and not as don't have as much lag as we might have seen historically. Because if you don't have and are going to choose to step away from those micromanaging behaviors, how do you need to really dial in on, you can't wait until the end of the quarter to really identify if something is going wrong. But the way you do that without reliance on team members is to have some good data and trend data that you can see throughout the quarter. So it's a good time to invest in that area. Embracing documentation and information transparency. So especially in startups, we hear, there's a lot of things, that information that's passed around through human to human, right? Not all companies are great at writing things down, but writing things down and sharing information openly within the company basically serves to remove human barriers or human roadblocks to people getting their work done. If we're going to let people work on different schedules and so forth, how do we make sure to really give them everything at their fingertips that they will need, so they don't get stuck every time they need to go ask another human how to do something or how to take the next step on the action they're trying to complete. And then last is really ties into the first one around goal setting, is building a culture of feedback. I've seen lots of companies do really great with goal setting, and sometimes things peter out a little bit on evaluation of goals at the end of the time period and really saying, did we meet this? Did we not meet this? And if we haven't, what recourse do we have? Like, how are we going to react to a missed goal? I think sometimes there's a bit of softness there that is probably going to need to become a little more firm in a completely virtual environment. So I think I can pass it back to you, Bob, for the next section.
Well, I think we're going to try, before we go to the next session, Michael's going to see if anybody has some questions, or I'm sure Michael has a few incisive questions himself, if no one else does.
Yeah, I've got one question I'm happy, to start with. And Barb, it goes back to what you said originally in terms of, leaders not micromanaging. I would argue, and what I've seen happen is, especially with more junior talent, in the beginning of their education, in the workplace, they need micromanaging to some degree in terms of having proximity to people to be getting, constant feedback and direction in some of their early days of learning. How are you finding the earlier workforce, who maybe still needs a little bit more of that micromanagement, is evolving into the current, and let's call it training as well, into the new world?
Yeah, and to be clear, I think there are a lot of aspects of working virtually that we haven't fully figured out, and figuring out how we employ emerging talent like new college grads and so forth successfully is, I think, one of the areas where there's still a lot to figure out. This is a group of folks who are building a model, right, for what normative workplace behaviors are. What does it look like to be an employee versus being a college student? And there's a lot of that can be developed through visual modeling, right? Like being immersed in a physical environment. I think there's a difference between, so that doesn't mean I'm saying hands up, don't know what the answer is, right? But some things we're trying. Micromanagement and collaborative working are different things, I think. And so if I use the software engineer example, we're using some sort of paired programming activities and things of that nature, where you're pairing a more senior team member with a new college grad, and they're doing productive work alongside one another in a virtual setting, right, with a video link open, things like that. And so that's probably the best solution that I've found, is creating collaborative opportunities. And then all of the things I just went through help as well. If things are written down in terms of clear expectations, someone who's just graduated college in theory could, start to develop the behaviors that they're going to exhibit by reading and understanding what you're putting forward in writing as well.
Michael, I just like to respond. So I think a lot of it has to do with the onboarding process, and whether you really have a good onboarding process for these newbies. And if you really can take some time with them in the onboarding process and teach them what are the rules of the engagement for the team, what are the rules for the group, how do people go about this, give them time to have informal interviews with the key team members. I think if you have a really good onboarding process, that helps get these people integrated quickly. But I would echo what Barb said. To me, the biggest problem I see with middle level managers and senior managers is they move up because they're great performers, and they have a lot harder time giving up control. And that's why they get into micromanagement. A lot of them just are saying, I can do it better, or I'm the, I don't want any mistakes here, so I've got to do it. So I really think micromanagement for a lot of these people is the biggest issue they face.
Yeah, and if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat window. There's a little red and blue chat icon down in the bottom of the screen. Feel free to type them in. Bob, one of the other things that we've been hearing and seeing happen a lot is what I call performance inversion, where to your point, a lot of the performers that were viewed as being top performers in the pre-COVID era have gone down the performance rung several levels. And the performers of today are not necessarily the top performers than before because of the increased flexibility, because they're better writers, they're better documenters, they're better emailers than necessarily what would have gone on in an office environment of performance theater. What are you seeing in terms of the performance inversion in companies, and the kind of the new skill set that's ultimately required for managers, and how that's changed today?
Well, I think it's a good point, and the core is better communication skills, because it's not like before you could just talk to people, walk around. Here, a lot of what you are what you write. You are your words. That's what's coming across. So people who are really good writers and really have mastered their own email techniques and mastered Slack and other forms of team messaging, these people really are rising to the top. And then just like what we're doing here in these presentations, it's easy to put a group of people in a meeting to sleep in Zoom or in SignalWire. So you've got to have different approaches to meetings and have, make them jazzier and break them up, more interactive, and using slides intelligently. So I think you still have people who are great performers, continue to be great performers, but it's the communication skills that really really rise to the top in this environment.
And one question was coming in from Adrian, and I was thinking this as well, is he said one of the biggest pitfalls of remote workers is a feeling of disconnection or loneliness. There's a lot of companies, I think, that are struggling to keep their culture together because they were, people that hung out together, that worked together, and that's where they got their source of energy. How are you seeing, this is a question for both of you, how are you seeing kind of companies address the mental barriers of I would say a world where your culture and your self-identity is potentially less formed of being physically, together with your coworkers in the office versus the amount of time you spend at home or living in a virtual world?
Well, this is where I would agree with Barb that good managers are really important, because good managers in the remote context really have to work a lot harder. It's really up to them to schedule regular team meetings, and those meetings not just reporting on what you've done, but giving people a chance to talk about what's in the week ahead and get some input. It's also a chance to have some team bonding before or afterwards, and have separate bonding events. And then I think good team leaders actually have to have one-on-ones with people, even if they're relatively short, every week. Otherwise, people really feel left out. They feel very isolated. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, is I do think the idea of having a totally remote team is not going to be attractive to a lot of companies. Most companies are going to want employees to come in 1 or 2, maybe even 3 days a week. And that's where a lot of that culture can be maintained. But you also got to do it through a better meeting structure and a more intensive management effort. Barb, I don't know, I'll leave it to you.
No, and from a loneliness perspective, I'm going to call on an Envision example, because that was a completely virtual, intentionally so, environment. And I think prevention is sort of the best medicine there. I think loneliness, especially if someone is coming into a virtual working situation for the first time, I think it can creep up on people. Like they're not expecting that this is going to be much different than what life was like in a physical environment, right? So people don't realize the extent to which like in-person interactions maybe sort of fill their social bucket, if you will, emotionally. And so we actually built it into onboarding to talk about loneliness being a very real concern of remote workers. We also tried to not completely devalue in-person interactions. So Bob gave the example of 2 to 3 times a week in an office. We didn't do that because we were a completely virtual company and trying to make that successful. But we created some very intentional times for folks to connect together. We were cognizant about where we were putting talent around the world and in situations where we could start to build small hubs of people where we could create connectedness. We obviously tried to do the sorts of stuff that people are doing right now during COVID, like virtual sort of social interactions and using different apps or different vendors that are running virtual events and things like that. But mostly, I think the fact that we talked about it as somewhat of a positive, working virtually gives people the opportunity to check back into their real lives in a way that maybe some people haven't done in a long time if they were having long commutes and working long hours. And so by talking about it in that context before the loneliness hits you, I think that's probably the best way to approach it that I've found.
Awesome, Bob. Let's go on to the next section. We can address.
Okay, let's go on to slide 12, and we're going to talk now about what the new workplace might look like. And here are a few background stats. One is that, and these are Labor Department statistics, that actually there was very little full-time work from home before COVID. It was only 2%. It surged to 42% in March and has declined a little toward the end of the year. The other thing we ought to realize is we're basically all in the knowledge economy, and those employees can work from home. Obviously, information services, financial management, white-collar professionals. But there are roughly half of the economy, half of the workers who really can't work very efficiently from home because they either need to see their customers, like people who are at restaurants, or they need to work with products and equipment. That includes healthcare, manufacturing, and transportation. Next slide. So what we see is that for the employees that can work from home, the overwhelming number of them want to work from home, but very few of them want to work all remote or all in person. Most of them want either 1, 2, or 3 days in the office and sometimes at home. And there are a number of studies that show that productivity is highest when employees choose exactly how many days they're going to come into the office or whether they're going to come in. But we have to realize that in an organization, there are some constraints in terms of getting everybody into the office on the same days. Those are critical for the sorts of things that Barb has been talking about building culture and building teams and having a way in which you bring young people into the fold. So I think it's fair to say that the optimal combination of work and in the office and work at home depends on many factors, and each company and each team may have to think of it in terms of what are the organizational structures, job types, and of course where you're located, your offices, whether there's a long commute or whether you have distributed offices. Last slide for me, 14. So we talk about the Goldilocks plan, meaning not too much remote and not too little remote. And that's what I think we're going to see most organizations trying to evolve to, though it may take them a while before they find the optimal mix. There are some strong advantages from working from home. I'm just going to name a few. It's easier to concentrate. People aren't interrupting in the office. You don't have commuting time, and that goes along with distributed offices, and that helps obviously in recruiting people from different parts of the country, if not the world. more flexible hours, and better work-life balance. On the other hand, we ought to recognize that there are some really distinct disadvantages of work from home. A lot of people depend on going into the office for the structure of their day. Here you've got to create your own structure. Work from home isn't so good for informal collaboration. You don't have these times in the coffee room or the water cooler. A lot of people are facing space and tech limits. They either don't have their own office or they don't really have a good high-speed internet connection. And as Barb mentioned, social isolation, which is a big issue. And I would add to that the issue of being a step removed from your boss. A lot of people are worried about whether they can get promotions if they're not in the office a lot so that their boss isn't seeing them. And I think that's something that every HR department is going to have to worry about. So let me stop there and let Barb come in and talk about her views on this.
Thanks, Bob. So I'm continuing with the Goldilocks analogy to talk about getting to just right, or maybe it's like how to choose the perfect bowl of porridge or something. But these are gut check questions, I think, for leaders. And at the surface, none of these are rocket science, but if you do really dig deep and press yourself on where you're truly at as an organization, I think most companies will find that there's some work to do as they work towards what is most likely for a lot of companies going to be a hybrid plan. So first is considering your own readiness. And I'm the you in the first question here is really referring to the CEO and the executive team. The funniest first question that I get when a company is thinking about going virtual is, and it's a common one, is, well, how will I know if folks are working? And it's a valid question, but what that tells me when that's like the first thing out of someone's mouth is that they are going to be challenged as a leader with things like not micromanaging and so forth. And so I would go back and actually talk about that, right? Like the overarching leadership team's readiness to embrace some of these different managerial principles. And, you know, are you willing to do that? Can you learn a new way to lead? Are you willing to learn a new way to lead? Same question applies to all of the leaders in an organization, but I think where this is also a little different is back to what I was talking about on my prior slide, where it's just be a good leader, right? Follow all of the leadership practices that you know that you should be following, but sometimes sometimes corners get cut, right? You know, are you having quality one-to-ones, et cetera? So here, what I'm meaning is really like, do you have a frontline leadership team that is ready to embrace the ability to be good leaders? And I mention that because a lot of us are growing quickly, and that's a perpetual problem that I've experienced in high growth companies, especially, is leaders who maybe are stretching into their first leadership role and don't have the toolkit of leadership practices or managerial practices yet. I think getting them that before embracing full remote is very important, or else hiring leaders who have that in their toolkit. Is the work or are your jobs ready? Bob shared that about 50% of jobs in the US just like don't convert, right? They have to be done in person. And I'm rounding on the 50%, but approximately. So of the 50% that remain, these knowledge jobs, which ones can be moved virtually? Common objection I've heard in the last year is around customer support or client success type positions. Oh, we can't have folks who normally work in a call center working from home. I think that was one of the largest success stories that companies saw in terms of a surprise that productivity with those groups. I haven't heard a single story yet where productivity within those groups in particular, who are traditionally a fairly highly monitored, hourly, overtime eligible workforce, as long as they have the space to be able to work. I've heard that problem more than them not being capable of working from home. So it's really just challenge yourself. If at first you're like, oh, I don't think that job could work virtually, just challenge the paradigm that you're using to tell yourself that it won't work remotely. Next is considering talent impacts. So this is both your current team and your the folks that you need to hire. If you are moving to a virtual model and you have a team, are there folks who signed up for your team who were not signing up for a virtual model? It really isn't for everyone. And this bullet is really just meaning understand that virtual work is not for everyone. Some people will require the social interaction of going into an office, and that may impact potential current team members' longevity with the company. But I do think it also should change the talent profile that you're looking for and what you're assessing for, to make sure if you have a highly virtual model, you're selecting folks who are able to thrive in the type of environment that we're talking about. This one I hope is interesting, and it's defining virtual practices will also require thoughtful redefinition of your in-person practices. I think this is something that people do forget, right? We get very busy saying like, okay, we need to be a virtual company. What does that look like? Being very intentional about if we go virtual significantly, why do we come together in person? Like, what are the business purposes? What is the frequency? What are the expectations around that? Because that does look different. And I'm taking the cue for this one from what I'm hearing about even the office environment, the physical office environment of the future is likely to look different if we are going to go to offices to do the type of work that requires us to interact with one another. We may need more meeting space, less cubicles, more soft seating for collaboration, those sorts of things. So you really do need to consider both sides of that coin in order to really have a clear model so people know how you expect them to work in the two different modalities. And then leveraging your new model as a strategic advantage. I think this one is huge, especially since we're talking with a group primarily of folks working in the early stage or growth space. This gives you an opportunity to compete in a bunch of different geographic markets than the few tech hotspots that exist in the world. And I think it's an incredible opportunity to find talent that may be overlooked by some of the sort of FANG companies or larger tech brands because you can go hire them anywhere. I've also used this to define like strategic sourcing in certain markets. For example, I use the example of Omaha, Nebraska, which is a very common hub for customer support centers. So, the ability to target talent as you source for open roles that potentially live in Omaha because there's a pool of talent there, that's an amazing advantage. And even more so when you think about the fact of not having to pay sort of Bay Area wage rates for customer support talent, maybe in the Bay Area, when you can instead be strategic and hire them in Omaha or a variety of other places that are known as hubs for that type of talent. But it translates to other functions as well. And I think that's it for me.
Awesome. So we've had a couple of questions come in, and as I said, if anyone has questions, feel free to add it to the little chat window, the blue and red down below. Question for both of you. If you think about, and this comes from the group, diversity of face-to-face, communication channels has reduced. We used to talk with the water cooler, the kitchen, the corridor, etc. Now, obviously, I think we've embraced Zoom or video-based communication as being our only channel. We're missing out on a lot of those little kind of blips and moments. I know personally I'm trying to reduce my video chats and do more phone calls again, just because I find it a little bit less tiring. What types of things are you seeing organizations do to help manage the Zoom fatigue of looking at what I think I heard one CEO refer to as their 9-inch prison box? They have a separate screen on their desk. How are you seeing organizations manage the psychological toll that comes from looking at interactive video all day, every day?
Well, I think one of the things in terms of scheduling is not to schedule 1 hour Zoom meetings, because then you wind up with back-to-back Zoom meetings, and that's a real killer. So you just establish a company norm that no Zoom meeting can take more than 45 minutes. At least gives everybody 15 minutes in between. The second thing is try to leave at least an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon open every day to deal with the various things that come up and just to give you a break. I like the idea, Michael, of using phone calls. I mean, if you know people well, there's no reason not to use phone calls, and they're good. And then another thing people are doing is they're trying to arrange for informal collaboration activities. So I know one company that says anyone in the company can set up a brainstorming session, and anyone who wants to can come. So that's a way to sort of let people interact more informally. And then, you can have, whether it's Zoom cocktail parties, or you have skit night, or you have some sort of game that people play. These are ways to promote this. Lastly, I'll say is it's really important to leave the video on after the meeting ends, because then that's where a lot of the informal chit chat can occur, and people can get clarification of things that they might not know, not sure exactly how they're happening. Barb?
Hey, Michael, can I add on that one? I think one of the things that's worked really well for us, and if you guys see the hamburger on the top right, if you don't see Room Navigator on SignalWire, have a look at it. But we intentionally created spaces with the SignalWire team that feel really different. So there's a cafe, and there's a New York cafe soundtrack that's going in the background. You can go hang out, have a chat. We got a lobby, a screening room. My favorite bar from Marin County, Silver Peso, there's a bar. So I one of the things that I'm interested in is how people, and I think to the question of how do you create the virtual water cooler space where it's really easy to kind of drop in. The other thing that we're trying to be really intentional about is being very explicit about the norms being, I think, very relaxed compared to what we'd expect in an office. So, if your kid jumps on your lap, or your dog jumps on your lap, or you want to eat your sandwich on a Zoom call, that's okay. It's encouraged and important to do. And I just think it kind of takes some of the formality out and allows some deeper conversations to happen. But love to know other people's thoughts too.
I thought you were going to say like to go for a canoe ride, Chris, to kind of break the Zooms up. You're just out there paddling, between Zoom meetings.
I did try a kayak ride on a SignalWire call. And this is a shout out to Evan, because I think he did the first underwater SignalWire conference, which was awesome with a couple hundred people. But yeah, I think changing the space both for you and for people you're communicating with, can help a lot too.
And just hopping in to add, agree with everything that's been said. I do think whether maybe not a kayak, but I am hearing about a lot of teams doing walking one-to-ones. So switching them to phone, and actually one-to-ones being a type of meeting that I guess a lot of folks don't necessarily need to share documents in and so forth. So taking a walk while you have those, making that more casual. I've had a couple of HR tech companies that I think are trying to creep into this space around like providing tools that help us to replace the water cooler. I don't know how far along they are, but I'm sure it's a matter of time, right, before folks start trying to help us address that issue. There are some companies looking at also helping organizations deliver things like all hands content or like cultural messages via podcast, so that you can, again, take the podcast and go for a walk or do something that gets you away from your desk. So I think we're going to see a lot of creative ideas in that area, but that's what I'm seeing so far.
Makes sense. And how do you feel about CEOs' ability to evolve? And I even look at my own behavior, and I've definitely historically been an in-office staff meetings, screens up, cupcakes for birthdays, standing up kind of person. And, my communication style has always really revolved around in-person contact. And I look at, some other, leaders in the portfolio company, and they have, a daily portal where anybody can come on and off for an hour and access and ask questions and hang out. They're set up on Notion. They're like meticulously blogging and creating content. And I see it working so well. Yet, I was definitely educated in a different time period. And I think all the new companies being created in this time period are going to be much more adaptable to this. I look all the way up to the big enterprise customers we have, where the senior executives are like, can't wait to get back to the office 5 days a week. And the younger talent's like, well, we're not going back. We're looking for new jobs. You're going back? We're not going back. We're not going back there.
Might be alone.
Yeah. And I think it even translates to, companies like Facebook that have taken, bought the old old Penn Station building or whatever to build a huge new space in Chelsea. How do you think all of this rectifies itself out in terms of the pretty substantial gap, I would say, generationally, in terms of workplace expectations that was already a gap before COVID, but now I think is further accelerated because people are heading off into their camps, and they moved across the country, and they've got used to seeing their kids for lunch or dinner, and all want to go back to a different place when this is all said and done. And it manifests itself like, we've never had as many rejected job offers, not for our company, but for clients, as how it happened in Q4 for different executives who are like, no, we're not relocating. We want to work remotely. And a difference between, remote work and commuting, I think, especially at leadership level, just seems like it's splitting off into two different directions here.
I think the market is going to force leaders' hands a little bit here, meaning CEOs who aren't ready. There are going to be plenty who are, and who are going to capitalize on the fact that there are folks who, to your point, Michael, are not willing to relocate, right, in a new world order. And so if you can't beat them doing it the way that you want to do, which is reverting back to fully in person, maybe the way to continue to compete is to join them and embrace some level of virtual work. That's actually why my primary commentary was really focusing around being super and deeply thoughtful around your own readiness and your leadership team's readiness, because that, I think, is where teams should be focusing today, so that when you get into a situation where, we have a vaccine in place and you can totally go back to the office, how do we not revert to just every leader saying, okay, the easy thing to do is like send everybody back to the office? And I think it's investing and preparing now in getting our heads around what this is going to look like later.
And Barb, you specifically thought about that and experienced that as a strategic advantage pre-COVID with Envision on talent. And I agree with Michael's point, which I think companies that aren't kind of prepared, for a permanent change, in how talent is attracted and retained, and thinking that we're just all going to go back to the office in September, are really going to be impacted negatively. Conversely, if you can really lean into it, you can really attract the best of the best. And I think Bob made comment to this too. You could really go global in terms of getting to talent. But easy to say, I guess, at one level, having done it at Envision and built a company of scale completely remotely, and then going to an environment like Peloton. Kind of curious your thoughts on the trade-offs.
Well, there are trade-offs, right? There are things that are not as easy virtually, many of which we've identified. But I think as long as you approach it as a company, as a work in progress, and knowing that communication can be more challenging, so not letting that go off your radar. Those are the kinds of commitments we made at Envision, where we were imperfect, but we were committed to making it better. We were measuring it in our engagement surveys and making sure that we were actually getting better over time. I think the opportunity, Chris, to what you're saying is kind of now, while others are kind of weighing the pros and cons of like, what are they going to do? If you are in a position to decide early that you want to embrace some level of virtual model, could you be the leader who's able to hire some of those folks that are declining Michael's offers because his particular client needs them to be in a certain place, right? If you can offer what people have an appetite for today while other companies take longer to figure it out, can you scoop that talent? And I think the answer is yes.
I think also, Michael, to answer partly your question is, I think that, again, all remote, there will be a few companies that will do it, but most companies will want some combination. And so the question is, how do you use that time in the office? And if it's a global company, do you get together at events twice a year? I mean, I ran a global investment operation for Fidelity where we had 4 or 5 different offices across the globe. Unless we brought them together twice a year, we just never had the chemistry that we needed. And I personally would go out to all these offices once a quarter. And so I think, I believe that for top CEOs and top managers, they've actually got to work a lot harder in a remote environment to make this thing gel. And, as Barb says, if you're prepared to do that, it's a big comparative advantage rather than you're just sort of being dragged along.
So we've only got a couple minutes left. I think what might be great, Bob and Barb, maybe if you each want to spend, 60, 90 seconds, final words of advice in closing. And I think it's been a very helpful and informative session. I know a bunch of people have 4 o'clock meetings. Just want to make sure we can wrap up on time.
Well, I want to go back to the idea of success metrics because I think that's the key to making this whole remote thing work. As Barb says, some CEOs are going to say, are these people just out fishing? Are they working? So if you have success metrics, you don't have to get into that. The question is, are they producing what they're supposed to be producing in the week or month or quarter? And here are the metrics. So don't be on my case as to, when I'm going fishing or when I'm being with my family and everything. So my experience is there's so much miscommunication, even when people think they're being clear about their goals and objectives. So success metrics takes that all down from a general level to a specific level. And it really helps on so many of these parameters that we've been talking about.
Awesome. Barb?
I think mine is really short, and that is it starts with leadership practices, and that is the first place that I would put my focus if I were, and I am, and so it is where I'm putting my focus on having leaders be prepared to embrace and know the skills necessary to successfully run virtual teams, and do that now, be among the first to figure it out instead of the last or those that get dragged along behind the rest of the market.
Awesome. Well, Barb, thank you very much and appreciate your insights. Bob, thank you as well. And your new book is coming out in March, I think, right? March?
Yeah, the end of March, right.
So we'll make sure we send a link out to everybody when that officially hits the bookstores. But thanks for making the time and very, very informative. Thank you.
Thanks for coordinating, Michael. Appreciate it.
It's all Chris. We are all beneficial to Chris's organizational abilities. So thanks, and I hope everybody has a really great Tuesday.
Thanks.
You guys, and this is Meryl talking. I just wanted to let you all know Chris's machine died. So a huge thank you for your time and your participation, to Bob, to Barb. Michael, thank you so much for moderating, and to the team at SignalWire for another successful meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
We
everybody.
should, in good practice, we should say that Barb and I, Michael, if you can, we should hang around for 5 or 10 minutes if people want to chit chat. So we ought to start right here with a good practice.
Yeah,
I've
that's
unfortunately got a 4 o'clock, but if
We are out of time on time. I want to thank Barb and Bob for the conversation, Michael for moderating. If those that want to hang out in the cafe, grab a cup of coffee. We'll stay there for a couple of minutes afterwards. It's on the room navigator on the right. And stay safe, everybody. Second half of the year will be better. I know it's going to be bumpy for a little bit. I really appreciate everyone's efforts. So we'll see you in the cafe if you can make the cafe. Thank you.